So hello and welcome everyone to another episode of the Sacred Wisdom podcast. In today's episode, we are going to discuss the Orphan Trains and Great Tartaria, also the connection to the World Fairs. So a very disturbing event that happened in 1864 was the Orphan Train Movement. And these were orphan children that were sent across America on trains. And there was a huge immigration movement during this time. And it lasted, I believe, a 30-year period, but maybe much longer. This is where they took orphans from the orphanages over the United States of America, and they put them on trains, and these were shipped around. And the farmers would give a requirement to what they wanted to the orphanages, and then the orphanages would send these children on the trains. These orphans were very likely to have come from Great Tartaria. And I'm joined with the amazing Stephen Denman again today. Thank you for coming along, Steve.
Hello, Zach, and how are you?
Very good. And you're going to tell everybody about this orphan train movement, first of all, and then move on to this migration that happened and the foundling homes. Start with maybe the mud floods and how that began and what pushed that migration.
Okay, so if we look back to the time of the first mud flood, we have to remember there was already a lot of evacuation and migration going on in northern Russia at that time, and a lot of assistance was being given by the Russian Imperial Army to move vast populations of Slavic Russians and various Turkic communities, as well as the Sami or the Laplanders out of the faraway north. Obviously encompassing the Kola Peninsula of the Murmansk Oblast as it's known today in northwestern Russia, in the Polar Urals, and also in the northern Urals of north-central Russia, and all the way across into the faraway east of Siberia and the Yakutsk Peninsula, and moving them initially up to the time that the actual most concentrated and most devastating duration and period of the first mud flood into places like Vladivostok, into cities like Sverdlovsk and Moscow or Moskva, and also
give
St.
people like
Petersburg.
a little, sorry, Steve, just a geographic location. So the mud floods would have started in northern Russia, and then these would have migrated down to, just so we get a flow and a pattern showing people visually how this happened.
That's right. So even if you go further out into the Arctic North Polar region, around where the Arctic continent is, and the various northern Russian islands that are scattered throughout the Laptev Sea and the White Sea, as examples, there was huge amounts of coastal inundation and destructive attritional processes that were going on, presumably from perhaps, ice caps that were melting in the Arctic continent at the time. We know that before the reaching of the most destructive period of the first mud flood, there were huge rainstorms, and there was more microscale flooding going on in northern Russia. And then obviously from the polar Urals and the northern Urals, a lot of this flooding then was downwardly moving through northern Russia and out across the various acreages of farmland, of meadows and fields, and causing major problems in the villages and the small towns there, making them almost uninhabitable. So this mass evacuation had started leading up to the most devastating period of the first mud flood. The same process then occurred with the second mud flood. So when we come on to the third mud flood, which reached its pinnacle around the 7th of June 1892, we then have to look at the orphan train movement as well. That was really started with these initial migrations in northern Russia, coming out of Great Tartaria, and then eventually moving into Eastern Europe, the Caucasus region, and from there into Western Europe and across to countries like Italy and Spain and Portugal, and then being put on freight ships and ocean liners and being transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the eastern United States. And you look at the timeline of the orphan train movement of the 15th of January 1864 to the 20th of December 1889. So there's definitely an interrelationship with those dates, and the second mud flood going into the third mud flood, and this huge shifting of populations, not just of husbands and wives, fathers and mothers, some of which were the Sami or the Laplanders, many of which were Slavic Russians, many of which, of course, were the Tartarian Aryans or these Nordic Tartarians, as well as many different Turkic communities, but vast numbers, literally millions of children that were basically without any parental guidance, any parental protection, had no family unit around them whatsoever. And these were then transported into the eastern United States. It became an industrial process in its own right, because you then saw millions of these children that had come from Great Tartaria, northern Russia, initially from Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region, and many of them were transported onwardly. In terms of logistics, the Russian government couldn't deal simply with the numbers of evacuated families and children coming in to, shall we say, southern Russia from northern Russia. It was impossible for them to actually deal with this problem because it was so ongoing. Now, we're not going to really go into discussing here what the main causes or factors were behind the first mud flood, the second mud flood, and the third mud flood. We'll
save that for a whole other podcast, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's very complex and there's many conspiracy theories. You can put inverted commas around that phrase. People have said, oh, it was to do with the Roman Catholic Church and the Jesuit order, or it was to do with negatively based extraterrestrials. But again, there's not a lot of proof documented wise to actually confirm either of those things. Again, it's just really wild speculation. But what we do know is there was these major upheavals with the first mud flood, second mud flood, third mud flood, the emergence of the orphan train movement that came out of these massive migration waves coming out of Great Tartaria and northern Russia, down into the Eastern Europe, the Caucasus region, into Western Europe, and across to the United States of America. Yes, some did go into Canada, but the majority of these children that became part of the orphan train movement, entered the Eastern United States, mainly through the harbor facilities in New York City and places like Manhattan, and were then transported into the various cities of Eastern United States and then the Midwestern United States.
Let's just talk a little bit about the different orphanages around the world, because there was orphanages in Moscow, Italy, Portugal, everywhere, all over European countries. And, this was going on a big way. And there was these also very bizarre things like foundling wheels, where they actually brought the babies to these homes that they couldn't manage or they couldn't look after, and they would drop these babies off, wouldn't they?
That's
right.
And
there was a whole process of processing these children like they were like products.
And the parents, the mothers and fathers, whether it was in countries like Italy or Spain or Portugal, when they were literally dispatching these children and dropping them off or delivering them to these orphanages, they didn't have to even give their first name, their surname, or the village, town, or city they were from. It was done completely anonymously.
Yeah.
I mean, that in itself, and there was no financial incentivization. It wasn't as though the local municipal authorities were going to these parents and saying, look, we'll pay you X amount of money to take your children off you and then transport them to the United States of America. It was a very bizarre time because it's against parental instinct to give away their children. And it wasn't as if there was like an invading army or navy or air force or some sort of mercenaries that were invading any countries, including obviously Great Tartaria and northern Russia or any part of Eastern Europe or Western Europe. So that in itself is very interesting. We could also argue that the orphan train movement really resulting out of these huge migration waves in mainland Europe with all these millions of parentless children really could be argued to be the initial stage or phase of what became the Industrial Revolution. It went from being an industrial revolution of separating children from their parents and then repurposing and reframing their thoughts, their behavior and attitudes in mainland Europe, and then transporting them into the United States of America, yes, to some extent Canada, but mainly within the United States, and then placing them in an alienated environment where they were terrified, they were full of anxiety, fears and worries, totally disorientated. They were given new first names and surnames. They became literally the property of the farmers in these different meadows and fields that they owned. They were, dairy farmers or cereal crop farmers, and they were just put out there as farm hands working, all year round and not being paid anything.
If anyone hasn't seen already, we have actually done a couple of episodes one called Imperial Children and one called Orphan Trains and Tartaria. You have some very bizarre events that happened during this time and during the Orphan Trains. And there was something that was created, which is very recent, I think came out in the 80s, 90s, which was the Cabbage Patch Kids. Now, right. This relates back to the Orphan Train movement, and it's almost feels like a mockery of these people. It's very dehumanizing the way this is put across, as much as we just see. And me and Stephen were very familiar with the Cabbage Patch Kids. They were very interesting looking dolls and, little cards, playing cards that you get, trading cards. But it's very odd. It's a very bizarre time. And it feels like so many problems occurred and grew out from all that situation, the trauma, because them kids would have gone through tremendous trauma going through that, even though they may not have vocalized it or said much about it. They probably couldn't because they were so deeply traumatized. And the other thing as well is, where were those parents? Where do you think those parents were, Steve?
I would say that a lot of the parents, especially if they were from Great Tartaria in northern Russia, they were seized and they were placed into originally these were palaces and healing temples of Great Tartaria, say built in the United States of America. And they were placed into these repurposed buildings that were then used as mental asylums, where they were locked up for the rest of their natural lives. Some of them may have been released if they were successfully reprogrammed, using perhaps various types of advanced hypnosis, as well as huge amounts of pharmaceutical medication to suppress their memories and to deculturalize their imprints and their memories of Great Tartaria, and that the way these Nordic Tartarians thought, behaved and acted in their civilization was not going to be allowed to be part of the new world order that was there to supersede the old world order that they had maintained for thousands of years, that had developed and evolved out of the civilization of the Scythian Aryans. I would then also like to add that I do feel that the Orphan Train movement was almost a giant occult ritual. And what I mean by that, if you think about it, if vast numbers of these children in the Orphan Train movement were actually from Great Tartaria, they carried the genetics and the heritage and the lineage of that civilization in northern Russia. It was almost as if they were being displaced from the original civilization of Great Tartaria and the old world order, being taken into the United States of America, where already much of the architecture from Great Tartaria, the buildings there that were built as part of the colonies of Great Tartaria, had already been repurposed. It was like they were deleting the history of Great Tartaria or suppressing it in northern Russia, and doing the same in the United States, shifting timelines around, bringing in these children, reprogramming, reframing their thoughts, behavior, and their routines and the belief systems they'd initially been given about Great Tartaria. A lot of the parents were then sent off into these mental asylums and locked up for the rest of their lives, many of whom would have died prematurely. Many of them probably died in the first mud flood, had died in the second mud flood. Many of the actual children who were orphaned in, say, Great Tartaria, northern Russia after the first mud flood and second mud flood were maybe living, in various villages, towns and cities, as is well known, with Russians themselves, Slavic Russians. This is well known. This was going on. So what appears to be happening is a sort of a mockery of this wonderful, grandiose epic that it existed in the historical timelines that is known as Great Tartaria, this great golden empire they had created just as there was the golden age of Atlantis, was therefore having to be shut down and suppressed. And the populations were needed perhaps because there was an underpopulation issue within the United States of America at the time. And in order to really get the industrial
build America, that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to, which we'll roll onto in a minute, but with the Industrial Revolution, that's what they were leading to.
That's
and obviously during this time, bear in mind, everybody, that the Orphan Train Movement, during the while this was going on, we had all the world fairs, which we'll come on to as well. But this was very interesting, this whole period, and it would make sense that the adults would have almost had breakdowns over this. The adults that were left over would have gone mental. So the mental asylums that were created, there was to be such a vast difference in the change of environments and change of control and order that they would have gone very crazy. It's a disturbing time that is not really explained very well. So just like we have situations happen now and things seem like they're for the benefit of humanity, back then it would have seemed like it was for the benefit of humanity. But now we reflect on it, all the people actually in them situations were going through complete and utter trauma. And you can clearly see from the photographs, these people are not in a good way. So Stephen, with the orphan train, so you had the orphan train. So we've moved, these migrants have gone over to all these different locations. It didn't just happen in America, though, did it? Obviously, it happened in Moscow, but not to the extent of the way there was something being built, set up in America. So that was the infrastructure was being built.
Yeah. The Industrial Revolution that was being planned and initially through the propaganda and the social mind control of the world fairs that themselves transitioned from more cultural and spiritual aspects and displays of heritage and history into becoming these social mind control experiments in preparing the human mind, the American people at the time, and obviously mainland Europeans with the idea of mass industrialization. But when you think of it carefully, when you look at all these different paintings and old faded black and white photographs of millions of very underfed, nutritionally poor children being crammed into all these factories. Most of them are barefoot. They've got literally shorts and little skirts on. They're not really supposed to be working in such dangerous environments with such huge amounts of machinery. There's no safeguarding going on. There's no proper health and safety awareness or training. And a lot of the photographs, what's interesting, you very rarely see any adults in a lot of the photographs. They're done deliberately to imprint the idea that the future of children is just part of this mass industrialization. Welcome to the industrial age, the industrial revolution, and get used to it. And that's really what was going on. It's interesting that a lot of these farmers were really going to these orphanages in the United States of America, and they were speaking to these higher degree Scottish Rite Freemasons that were running these establishments, and they were literally saying, I want that child or I want this child. So they went from being in an agrarian environment, in a rural environment, in farmsteads, in the eastern United States, in the Midwestern United States, into suddenly then, within a couple of generations, a lot of them being then transported again, or they were being repurposed as the buildings of Great Tartaria were being repurposed. There was a biological repurposing as well as a construction and architectural based repurposing. So this was going on every level. And you can argue, if it's that easy to repurpose healing temples as chapels, churches and cathedrals and mansions and stately homes and palaces as government buildings or government premises, then it's just as easy, therefore, within a 20-year period to repurpose the subconscious minds, the psychological perceptions of millions of children and adolescents into then believing that the way they exist at that point in their lifestyles is all there is. And they have to go out and they have to earn a wage and pay taxes. At the time, it would be the US federal government, as it is today. And that wasn't how Great Tartaria in northern Russia really functioned in terms of how people were given a purpose in life in terms of a vocation or employment. It was done very differently, as we know, because they were a society based on biological balance and equilibrium and medical restoration. So an individual was part of a whole, was included at all times in those communities and societies of Great Tartaria. Nobody was excluded. There wasn't parentless children. There wasn't high divorce rates, as we've discussed previously. The basis was developing spiritual integrity of, for each soul personality, and developing an adoration and a love for the universal creator, and understanding and nurturing their own Christ consciousness. So going from all of that, and whatever the factors were that led up to the most destructive phase of that third mud flood, and it's no coincidence when you look at that third mud flood that happened on the 7th of June, 1892, less than 12 months later, we have the World's Columbian Exposition, or the Chicago's World's Fair, held in Chicago in the eastern United States of America from the 1st of May, 1893 to the 30th of October, 1893. I mean, you couldn't make that up. That's not a coincidence.
And the interesting thing is, at that point, people would have been very excited by that. After all this trauma and catastrophe, then something like that happening, a world fair, like something of excitement, people would have been pulled to it. So you can understand that the way people would have seen it in society, they wouldn't have seen this stuff. We've now got the ability, thankfully, to the internet, that we can actually see all this stuff, and we can see this information properly displayed to us, and how crazy. I mean, it was shocking. I was blown away at this information. I mean, it's 40 years it went on for the Orphan Train Movement. 40 years, 13.8 million immigrants going through there from Eastern Europe. And I probably would say more than that. That's the official number, or around that number.
That's an industrial process. That's a macro scale industrial process of shifting populations to create new demographics in a completely separate geographic landmass called, North America.
And people need to know that this is what the reset is. This has happened before. This is real stuff. This is real information. So we had the farming, agricultural era of America. Actually, it was a very flourishing time.
The United States of America became a resource-based economic powerhouse. It became the most prosperous, the most wealthy country on the surface of planet Earth.
Yeah. And interestingly, why?
Yeah, I mean, with mass immigration coming in constantly, and then you had obviously the in North America, this building of the railroad between the eastern coast of the United States of America, where the Atlantic Ocean is, right the way across to the west coast of the United States of America, where the Pacific Ocean is. And that railroad system which is seen in many of these Wild West movies from Hollywood. You see the construction of that huge railroad, which literally cut straight through all the original territories of the American Indians. I know a lot of people say they shouldn't be referred to as Native Americans, but I'm saying it from the academic point of view that, many archaeologists and therefore many anthropologists use. So just for the sake of argument, we'll use that phrase. They could be called indigenous Americans. You could call them that. That's probably more correct. But it's like everything was geared towards this mass industrialization, and layers upon layers of suppression and deletion, resetting, more deletion, suppression, and censorship. We go right the way back to the time of the 31st of December, 1728, really with the last account of the sighting of a white giant, or a Tartarian giant, in the United States. And then you look, literally just over 11 years later, we have the first mud flood on the 8th of January, 1740, pouring down through, billions of tons of silt and earth and clay, and literally torrents of overflowing rivers and lakes going everywhere, inundation across thousands of square kilometers in northern Russia. So are these all just coincidental events in a chain reaction, or was there other, shall we say, other forces or other factors that were at play in the background? Again, that can be discussed another day, but it's very interesting to see how there was all these convergences, and then suddenly there was a lot of extensive planning going on, running in parallel to these first mud flood, second mud flood, third mud flood, and then you've got all this huge shipment. And I use that word deliberately. A shipment usually means like cargo, because really what a lot of these orphan children, from Great Tartaria, northern Russia, and then those that went into even Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region, they were just seen as a commodity. They weren't seen as, human beings with a soul personality that have feelings and emotions. There didn't seem to be a lot of child welfare going on back then. I'm sure it was also very harsh for them when they were put into these orphanages. It wasn't easy. If we look at, for example, the great English novelist Charles Dickens, look at the character he created called Oliver Twist in that orphanage, during the Victorian age, such a harsh environment. And that would have been very similar for all these children from Great Tartaria and northern Russia and parts of Eastern Europe that were being funneled.
And what was the saying the catchphrase that you remind you from the Oliver Twist films? Is that of interest?
The phrase is, "Please, sir, can I have some more?"
So it's interesting. That's the sort of thing you remember, don't you? You see,
Oliver Twist dares to say that in defiance, even though he knows he will be quite brutally punished for it, or he'll assume that he's going to be brutally punished for it. But he says it in a way, probably because he doesn't have a lot to lose. And I think a lot of those children probably had nothing, subconsciously, they had nothing to lose. It's very upsetting when you think of, lovely little children and what they would have been going through, and the ones that were more fortunate would have been the brothers and sisters from Great Tartaria and northern Russia, who may have been adopted as siblings by one set of parents or one farmer in the United States.
Now, just to say on that note, there has been very beautiful stories about the orphan train, so it's not all negative. There, of course, is some people that have explained it being, it saved my life. I've read accounts from people that, had grandparents as orphans that were on the orphan trains, and they say it was a great benefit. So it isn't all doom and gloom, but the point is,
it was a mixed outlook. It wasn't all just negatives.
No,
there were positives. There's many,
but it was it's very dangerous when people take advantage of these, negative situations that happen on our planet, and that's what we need to be aware of. These players that play these markets, look at just what's going on around the world at present, and you'll see lots of very wealthy people just suddenly appearing on these disastrous places, so suddenly all willing to help. And this is happening a lot, and we've really got to kind of understand it. But Steve, the Chicago fairs is mind-blowing. Now, to me, that is the most mind-blowing of all the fairs, because of the amount of destruction done after it as well, and also the fact they built that, apparently, again, like every structure in the 1800s, they built it in 1 or 2 years. And these are, impossible to build at that rate even now. But these have got no foundations. Apparently, they're built out of plaster and all this stuff. I mean, you couldn't make this up. This is what people say it is, because there's a very disturbing account there from a guy called Martin Arthur Cooney, who actually set up what was called the infotariums, and actually brought these around the world fairs. And these were orphan children that were put in incubators, or they were also called the incubator babies. So they were grown embryos and all this stuff, and how you make babies. And they would put these into the incubators and grow these babies. So very bizarre. And when I heard about this, my jaw dropped, actually, of how horrific it is. And so what do you think about that incubator babies and where that brought America? Almost like, do you think they were like, now today we have almost like cloned people around us, or maybe even possible that was you could say the incubator babies were like the start of the early days of cloning even? What do you think on that?
Well, if we look back to the World's Columbian Exposition, or the Chicago's World's Fair, that was held from the 1st of May 1893 to the 30th of October 1893. Firstly, the architecture there was incredible. It was very Greco-Roman. A lot of it had connotations of the civilization of Atlantis. So there was water fountains, there was huge artificial symmetrical lakes, beautiful palatial buildings with sweeping staircases, really quite beautiful, incredible statues. It was a very epic environment to go and attend. It really was very, very nice. Tables with parasols and lovely restaurants there, beautiful ornate horse and carriages. And then you had these children, the incubator babies, that were part of a showcase piece for millions of Americans to go and ogle at and have a good look over, and what's all that about, and become very inquisitive and curious about, and then feed back the information, of course, to friends and family. Now,
5 cents they paid, 5 cents.
Yeah, so that was an industrial process because they were making a lot of money out of that. It was a real spinner. So, yeah. But then you have to ask the question.
Well, just say, Steve, were they making money? I mean, really, they'd have to have a lot of people to go through. At that time, the incubators like that would have cost a huge amount of money to build, and it wouldn't have been. Was it about the money? That's what I look at. I think it's not. I think it's almost like putting the trauma into the human, instilling more trauma.
I would say that, but you have to remember that if you understand the third party debt usury system, that money, even when it was gold and silver backed, is pretty much printed out of thin air.
Yeah.
Then, it's no issue whatsoever to produce the resources if you control the flow of money at the top of the system with a capital S. Number two, a lot of those buildings were already there at the Chicago World's Fair, because they had been repurposed from Great Tartaria, because Chicago, as we know, like New York.
You can't make this stuff up, and someone's gone to great lengths to really cover this, or little lengths, actually, because there's no construction. There's 2 free construction photographs on the whole of the Chicago World Fair.
Exactly, and the site was absolutely vast. It was
massive.
A massive site. It was city-sized, and it was extremely palatial and ornate and very luxurious. So you have that aspect. So a lot of the costs involved with construction would have been stymied by the fact that many of the buildings were already there. They may have given them a lick of paint, maybe given a bit of external rendering, and you put a few pictures up inside and added a few statues. But so that would have helped to speed up the construction process. The money that was then made, that money maybe was from the people watching the incubator babies and actually viewing what was going on, was money that was being made by specific individuals, as you've mentioned him already. So that is a separate aspect. You were asking me about what I believe the incubator babies was. What was the overall reason that was showcased there? What was that about? I believe it was about an attempt to reprogram the family unit, to show that the state could step in, and the state itself, which at the time would be in the US federal government, could, as a state healthcare facilitator, could come in and actually look after those babies, the incubator babies. And it wasn't necessarily the case that always that a father and mother in a marital relationship would have to do that. And then if you take a look at the onset, maybe only in the 1950s, really, you have the emergence of post-World War II, when World War II ended on the 8th of May, 1945. Within literally 10 years of that, say late 1950s into the early 1960s, in the United States of America, in Canada, in parts of mainland Europe, you had less and less influence from the religion of Christianity, especially Roman Catholicism, and the importance of marriage and the family unit, and the arising of single parent families. And then the state, in the whichever government we're talking about here, could be any European government, for example, or even here in the United Kingdom of Great Britain with HM government, would step in and act as a state facilitator in some capacity. So this again was about removing really some elements of the cultural imprinting, again from Great Tartaria and Northern Russia, where, as I've said many times before, the idea of divorce and single parents it was pretty much non-existent. And even if they were, the way it was facilitated and handled and managed was totally different.
The children were used quite a lot in the world fairs as well, so they actually made sort of little shows, and they almost did things in, so I think it might have been in the Chicago World Fair, things like the Midget City,
Yeah.
where they actually had children dressed up making out they were midgets and
Yeah.
had them dressed up like, again, what you just see this as just a mockery of the human
Yeah.
existence. It really is, right?
Well, you have to remember that
because
if
them
you look at,
children weren't happy. They weren't smiling and performing. They were very sad.
yeah, but I know it happened at the fifth exposition, which was also known as the Exhibition of Products of French Industry.
Yeah,
Notice the phrase French industry. And
yeah,
that took place on the 25th of August, 1819 to the 23rd of September, 1819 in
right,
Paris in north central France. And what they did was they used many of the children that had come from Great Tartaria, from the Turkic people,
right.
as midgets and dressed them up in little, some of them had blonde beards and blonde wigs as well. And they looked utterly miserable. And so this is very interesting. It's interesting that fifth exposition actually took place around, obviously, the Eiffel Tower, or near
Yeah.
to the Eiffel Tower, which is being purported to have actually originally been a huge transmitter and receiver of telluric electricity from the atmosphere, which was part originally of a colony from Great Tartaria before it was totally repurposed. So again, you could say that was an inversion, another mockery, another distortion of the true history of the past, and snubbing the actual any collective awareness that Joe Public has, in this case being the French people, French citizens,
Yeah.
as to the true origins and historical timelines of their own past, and the cultural influences that Great Tartaria and Northern Russia had on not just France, but pretty much all of Western Europe, as with North America, as with Latin America, parts of the Middle East, and Central Asia and Southern Asia and so forth.
So bring it up today. Do you think that them orphan children, some of them orphan children that came out, what do you feel about them becoming like Hollywood stars, and some of them almost being programmed and almost like being purposed to be at certain actors or certain roles in society?
It may seem a bit abstract to say this, but I think it's poignant and relevant. If
Yeah.
we take a look at the two flags of Great Tartaria, so the first flag is the griffin on a yellow background, and the second is an owl on a yellow background. So one represents the griffin, that is, represents the wealth and opulence of the royalty, the aristocrats of Great Tartaria. The owl representing secret knowledge, wisdom, and the hidden and the concealed, if you like. What became really known today is Western occultism and Eastern occultism, but that was the knowledge that was preserved and cherished by the common people, the ordinary Tartarians. Now, if you therefore say that if many of these children from Great Tartaria and Northern Russia then were eventually transported into the Eastern United States of America, some of them would have come from lineages that would be classed as Tartarian royalty or Tartarian monarchy. And it could be the case that those bloodlines or ancestral lineages possibly could have been looked at and then repurposed through various kinds of mind control as a complete mockery, again, of the adulation and the focusing by the common people on the Christ consciousness, and therefore being selfless and kind and empathic, to being a very self-centered, quite narcissistic and self-obsessed and self-driven ideology based on the cult of the self, the cult of the celebrity, the cult of those who have become actors and actresses in Hollywood, the holy wood of Druidism. So that in itself is definitely something that can be considered, and it would make sense because obviously, as you know, as I know, and many other people know, Hollywood has been used to create what is known as predictive programming and cultural creation. And both of those phrases are with capital first letters because they are socio-cultural and socio-economic phenomena that aren't taught in any schools, colleges, or universities, but they're about collectively reframing the minds and the thoughts and the beliefs and really the aspirations of millions of human beings on planet Earth that would go to a cinema or watch a DVD with these Hollywood actresses and actors in. So, and I do think, and I say actresses to begin with, because I think the female as an archetype has been used in more subversive ways, really,
of course,
than the more
yeah.
male-based archetypes in Hollywood, because a lot of what Great Tartaria was about really was connected to the divine matriarchy, and there was a complete balance between the divine matriarchy and the divine patriarchy in that those geographic expanses of northern Russia. And I think, if you remember, as I've said before, but Edgar Cayce, America's sleeping prophet, said in one of his sort of semi-conscious clairvoyant visions, he actually said that Mother Russia, or shall we say the Russian landmass, would become the hope of the world because of its spiritual revivalism, and not just because of the Russian Orthodox Christian church, not just because of that. So if the elites and the secret societies had some of these orphan train children who were of the genetics and the lineage of the Tartarian royalty and Tartarian monarchy, that were then transported into the eastern United States, and they had maybe certain data or records that somehow were able to indicate historically that this was factual, that we were not obviously readily available to the American people or the American public. Again, this is this speculation. It would then make sense that they would be seen as very valuable in the complete overhauling and repurposing of the future of American society, not just with going from an agricultural based civilization, but into being one focused on mass industrialization and global conquest through economic and financial investment and development and construction of infrastructure projects and so forth. So at the same time, you want entertainment for the masses as a form of distraction, but it also acts as a form of predictive programming and cultural creation. And what better way to do that by having these children who come from originally, some of whom came from Great Tartarian northern Russia, because as we've already mentioned, all of them had their names deleted, their original names, whether that was in Cyrillic Russian or one of the Turkic languages, or whether some of them had genetic ancestry from the Sami or the Laplanders, who today live in northeastern Finland and northwestern Russia, and also north central Russia, and also northeastern Russia. But even they would have had tribal elders or tribal chiefs that would have been the equivalent of seen as kings or princes, as they would have been perceived by the Tartarian Aryans or the Nordic Tartarians. So it's a huge subject, this, and there's so much unwritten and so many gaps and so many questions that are unanswered, and so many things just don't make any sense, and you don't see really any forthcoming answers being logically presented by, certainly not by the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., certainly not by really any research institute, certainly not by any universities. Anyway, you're never going to see Oxford University or Cambridge University in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, coming out and making a public statement on all this information on Great Tartaria.
I believe we will one day. I believe that it will happen. I think that the funniest thing is that people thought, whoever acted in this way thought they could get away with it. And this was something that they don't understand, the law of karmic energy and the way it works. It's not like you do bad things, they come back at you, but this was demoralizingly wrong. And these things that happened have, I believe, brought society to the mess we're in today. And the reason why we're so baffled and confused is due to these history, the distortion of history, but yet actually what's happened in history. And probably, we could say that actually history has been distorted because it's too traumatic for humans to take on board. Let's be honest. Like, a lot of people don't like hearing, and I get that. And I get that humanity, but at the same time, you can't be running societies like that, as much as people think that is okay, or some whatever it is. We'll talk about that another time. You can also see on the channel, we've got Imperial children, we've got world fairs, and we've also got him what was it called, Orphan Trains and Tartaria. So they're 3 very interesting episodes with amazing research and detail in them, so please watch them. Steve, is there anything else you want to talk about within this subject? We can go on vastly, we can go on for hours, but we're trying to pull this together so everybody into bite size as much as possible, because we want people to be getting on with their lives, not sitting by a computer all the time. We want them to kind of be getting out and doing these things and learning from this information. But
we're putting the information together so that other people don't have to spend hours and hours and days and weeks on end researching it for themselves. We'll give them certain pointers, but it helps if we can summarize what we're doing in these presentations on Great Tartaria and Northern Russia. But I will say, I don't actually believe there will be any official statements by, whether it's Oxford University or Cambridge University or, any other university or research institute on planet Earth, where they're just going to openly say, yes, they got it wrong. Yes, they've invested far too much time, money, and resources in the artificial narratives of the historical timelines that have been fabricated. And what's going to happen, I believe, with Great Tartaria, bit like with the whole subject of unidentified flying objects or UFOs,
breakaway civilizations, all this stuff,
and ultra terrestrials. Bit by bit, it's going to be presented, and the overwhelming impetus that's coming from Joe Public, ordinary internet users who are fascinated with this subject matter, will keep wanting to know more and understand more, and more people discussing it on blogs and forums and putting new video content up like we're doing. And eventually that will reach a viewing threshold where so many people understand that there's all this evidence, this documented historical truth that's just being basically put aside and ignored, that eventually that will be accepted more and more as the mainstream by, British people, by people across mainland Europe, the Americans, the Canadians, all over the world. It will be accepted. It's kind of like that whole aspect of apparently disclosure, where we're all told that we expect fleets of alien spacecraft to land, in a country somewhere, maybe in the United Kingdom of Great Britain or mainland Europe, and they're going to meet with heads of state or some president or some prime minister. I don't see any of that happening. Disclosure's been going on for the last.
Well, if they're intelligent, I don't know if they would be meeting currently the leaders we have on this planet. I mean, if any alien was coming onto this planet, I don't think they'd be very representative of humanity. So I don't know if that would work out too well. But, Steve, brilliant. And please, everybody, thank you, everybody, for watching. And please watch the other episodes of The Hidden History. What we're doing with these podcasts is elaborating on more of the subject and talking a bit more in detail. But it is all down to you guys as well to do your own research and look into this. Look at all the points we talk about and research them further. You'll find all this information. It can be disturbing, but it is absolutely incredible as well. Credible information. But please, as well, if you'd like to go further into the research of both me and Stephen have done, please purchase our book, Mysterious Realities, which is available on Amazon in paperback, and you can also get on ebook, or you can purchase direct from my website on the link below. And Stephen, again, as always, your knowledge is greatly appreciated. Thank you for sharing it with everybody today. And it's a bye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.